Good morning, good afternoon. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited about the conversation we're going to have with our three panelists today. I'm just going to give like 30 more seconds. A lot of people are filtering in right now before we officially kick this off. Okay, I think we're out of stable. Like I said, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us from wherever you're tuning in from. We're really excited about today's conversation. Today is our third Startup Showcase series of the summer. We're looking at the power of oceans. We're going to explore two different verticals in this space and learn from three different innovators. Just briefly through the agenda, I'll do a really brief introduction. Follow that, I will hand it over to our keynote, Steve Oldham from Captura. We will then hear from two of our CarbonNext innovators, Martin van den Berg and Andrew Ray, to talk about their technologies. And then we will have a panel discussion and followed by closing remarks. If at any point during the presentations you do have a question, please feel free to drop that in the chat and we will ask that during the panel discussion. As always, we like to start off with our land acknowledgement. So with gratitude and respect, we acknowledge that the lands on which Foresight operates are the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Personally, I gather on the lands of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. And this territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon, One Plume Agreement. If you feel so inclined, please drop your land acknowledgement in the chat. So just a little bit about Foresight, if you're unfamiliar with us, we are Canada's largest clean tech innovation and adoption accelerator. We've been in operations for a little over 11 years now. We've supported over 1,200 Canadian clean tech companies. We have a network of, it's actually closer to 300 global clean tech EIRs and mentors, over 400 private capital partners, 150 national impact partners. Since our inception, we've curated over 25,000 different climate connections, and we have an audience of about 15,000 in our clean tech community. Our goal here at Foresight is to help the world do more with less sustainably, and one of the ways we do that is through our CarbonNext program. So our CarbonNext program has been in operations for 3 years. We've supported over 50 different Canadian clean carbon tech companies. We have the largest pipeline of emerging carbon management solutions, and we provide support for ventures looking to commercialize and supporting industry and adopting these business-friendly technologies. CarbonNext is a joint program, so our partner is Carbon Management Canada. CMC is a leading specialist in advancing strategies and technologies for emissions storage, management, and reduction that shape Canada's low-carbon landscape. They support large-scale carbon management projects through innovation and applied research activities, with a focus on monitoring carbon in the subsurface, the validation and integration of fugitive emissions monitoring technologies, and the development of a skilled workforce through training, education, and outreach. And so let's just set the stage for today. How can the ocean support carbon management? The ocean generates 50% of the oxygen we need. It can absorb 25% of all carbon dioxide emissions, and it captures 90% of the excess heat generated by these emissions. It is not just the lungs of the planet, but also its largest carbon sink, a vital buffer against the impacts of climate change. And today we're going to explore how we can utilize its power to support our goals with carbon management. So I am your monitor. My name's Shannon. I am the program manager for CarbonNext here with Foresight. And enough from me. I'm going to pass it over to our keynote, Steve Oldham, the CEO of Captura. Steve is a prominent entrepreneur and carbon removal advocate. His career has focused on bringing innovative technologies to market in a variety of domains, including robotics, aerospace, and climate. Steve was previously CEO of a leading direct air capture company that you may have heard of, Carbon Engineering. And with that, I'll pass it over to you, Steve.
Great, thank you. I'll let you know when I want you to advance the slide, Shannon, but let me first start by thanking Foresight for the opportunity, and I'm delighted to be able to talk with you all and share the stage with my fellow panelists. So before I get into oceans, just a quick word about carbon removal. The carbon removal problem is really, really big. So over the last 5 years, I started at Carbon Engineering at the start of 2018. At that time, carbon removal was not widely understood or widely even appreciated as part of the climate solution. But starting with the IPCC report that was actually released in 2018, we have developed a much greater understanding of how carbon removal is critical in the fight against climate change. Carbon removal allows you to eliminate any emission from anywhere on the planet, any moment in time, and of any type. It's a very ubiquitous solution, but it's hard. CO2 in the atmosphere is 400 parts per million. So trying to extract it is like taking a single drop of ink out of an Olympic-sized swimming pool. So as we look to develop solutions for carbon removal, because IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, estimates we're going to need 10 billion tons of carbon removal, even if we succeed on all the decarbonizing initiatives to try and stop emissions at source. 10 billion tons, it's a lot. So to succeed and produce a solution, it's all about scale. Can you get to a sustainable, large-scale deployment of CDR, carbon dioxide removal technology? And that's where the ocean comes in. It's my belief that the ocean can be one of, if not the most important elements of addressing climate change. So I'll try and position why that's the case, and then I'll talk a little bit about the company that I now run, which is called Captura. Next slide, please. So the ocean is the best carbon removal device that we already have. Imagine if we were starting from scratch and we had to remove 10 billion tons of carbon from the atmosphere. You'd be really happy to hear that 70% of the surface of the planet is already doing that. It happens naturally, doesn't require power, doesn't require technology, doesn't require any materials. The ocean's already absorbing, I have it at 30% of emissions every single day. I'll talk about why that is on the next slide. So what if we could harness this power of the oceans to remove more carbon, but without damaging the ocean? One of the things that not many people understand is that as we put more CO2 into the atmosphere, we are badly hurting the oceans. The ocean absorbs its share, it becomes more acidic, it becomes warmer. Acidic oceans lead to blanching of the coral reefs, threatens marine life development, and warming of the oceans creates extreme weather events and also affects marine life as well. So are there ways in which we can utilize this immense scale and power of the oceans for carbon removal, but do so in a way that doesn't harm the ocean, and if anything, actually helps it? So the good news is the answer to that question is yes. But before I get there, let me tell you a little bit more. Next slide, please. This chart on the right is both a great chart and not a great chart. It's really good for information, but it's hard to read. So I'll tell you where it's from. It's from a Washington, D.C. NGO called Carbon 180. They produced a really good report on marine CDR. This picture is from it. It's public domain. You can go look at it. What it shows you is the different categories of marine CDR pathways. Broadly speaking, there are 5. Macroalgae cultivation, that's where you put seaweed or kelp into the ocean to absorb more CO2. You can change the upwelling and downwelling of the ocean because CO2 contained in ocean water that is in the deep ocean stays there permanently. You can fertilize the ocean by adding nutrients, which creates more material, which can absorb CO2. You can add material to the ocean to increase its alkalinity. And the more alkaline the ocean is, the more CO2 it can absorb from the atmosphere. Or lastly, you can do what Captura does, which is called direct ocean capture. And that's physically removing CO2 from the ocean to allow the ocean to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So each of these different approaches to marine CDR has positives and negatives. Quite correctly, the ocean health community wants to ensure that anything we do for marine CDR doesn't impact the ocean any more than what we're already seeing. As one oceanographer in Washington told me, we've messed up the atmosphere, let's not mess up the oceans as well. So for us at Captura, that's a guiding principle. We want to make sure that whatever we do with the ocean, we maintain ocean health. Next slide. So why is the ocean doing this work? Why is it absorbing all of this CO2 from the atmosphere? Every time you fly to Hawaii or wherever you go, 30% of your emissions end up in the ocean permanently. It's because of something called Henry's Law. I'm not a high school chemist. I'm not a university trained chemist. The definition of Henry's Law is on the screen there. Basically, it means that the ocean and the atmosphere are in equilibrium with respect to CO2 content, which means the more CO2 you put into the atmosphere, the ocean has to maintain the equilibrium, so it absorbs its share. I'm a really simple guy, so I have a simple explanation of Henry's law. And next press, please. The simple explanation of Henry's law is a glass of Coke or soda, beer, champagne, whatever your poison is. The people who make those drinks put excess CO2 into them because they want to make them fizzy. When you open a can of, I'll use the example of Coke, when you open a can of Coke and you pour it out onto the table, into a glass, you'll see that it's fizzy. You see bubbles start to emerge. And then you come back half an hour later and the drink has gone flat. So why is that? Well, that's Henry's law in operation. There is too much CO2 in the Coke compared to the atmosphere. There has to be an equilibrium. So the atmosphere literally sucks the CO2 out of the Coke. That's why you see all those little bubbles coming up to the surface, and why when you come back half an hour later, the Coke has gone flat. Henry's law in operation. Next, please. So this effect works the same the other way. So if you take CO2 out of a liquid, then the atmosphere will put CO2 back into it. So now suddenly here is a mechanism in which we can utilize the 70% of the Earth's surface, which is removing CO2 from the atmosphere, has that ability. If we can take CO2 out of the ocean will take it out of the air, the same quantity. And of course, our oceans are enormous. By doing so, you enhance the ability of the ocean to remove atmospheric CO2, but you don't increase CO2 levels within the ocean. So you stop the process of ocean acidification from getting any worse than it is today. There are also ways, by the way, that you can start working on fixing ocean acidification using the same concepts. So why does all of this make sense? Well, if you're trying to take CO2 out of the atmosphere, it's 400 parts per million. It's difficult to do. My old company, Carbon Engineering, does it very effectively by building large fans, drawing air in. The air reacts with a chemical, and that way you capture the CO2. But you have to move an enormous amount of air. CO2 in the ocean is 150 times more volumetrically concentrated, and the oceans move pretty reliably. Ocean currents, the direction of those are well understood. So we can use, pardon the pun, the motion of the ocean to power systems that can extract CO2 out of the ocean at 150 times greater concentration. And then we can leave the ocean to do the job of taking it out of the air. Next slide, please. So it all sounds like magic, but here's a little pictorial demonstration of the Captura process. So now I'll talk more about direct ocean capture as a solution. So the picture on the left describes what I talked about already, the equilibrium between the ocean and the atmosphere. As we emit more CO2 into the atmosphere, the ocean absorbs its share. A Captura plant pulls in shallow ocean water. It physically separates, using the process called electrodialysis, the CO2 from the ocean water. That CO2 is measurable. It's a stream. It's just like direct air capture. You can utilize that CO2 to make synthetic fuels like aviation fuel, for example, or you can sequester it exactly the same as direct air capture to create carbon credits and permanently put the CO2 back underground where it came from in the first place. The only other thing that comes out of a Captura plant is CO2 depleted ocean water. That then goes back into the shallow ocean. And Henry's law says, okay, you're CO2 depleted. You now need to absorb CO2 back out of the atmosphere. So the net effect of this process is you take CO2 out of the atmosphere, put it back underground where it came from in the first place, and you don't affect CO2 levels within the ocean. What's unique about Captura's process? Everything we do is focused on scale. Our process uses no chemicals or absorbents. There is no other material. It is just renewable energy and ocean water. We produce no byproducts. There's nothing to be disposed of here. If you're going to do this at 10 billion ton scale, you need to do it in a way that doesn't require lots of input material or generate lots of waste material. We add nothing to the ocean. We don't, in the words of the oceanographer, risk messing with the ocean. We integrate really well with renewable energy. One of the challenges of carbon removal is it's energy intensive if you're doing this using any form of technology. And there are other customers for renewable energy. Our process works really efficiently with renewable energy. We can power our plants up and down in a very short period of time. And we plan to operate our plants using off-peak energy so that both our costs are lower and we're not creating conflict. And of course, these plants can be based onshore, for example, desalination plants that already move ocean water, power stations that use ocean water for cooling, or they can be put offshore. A single oil and gas platform can accommodate about 1 million tons worth of carbon removal using our technology. So it's a great opportunity for us to repurpose the infrastructure that we use in the energy sector today as we go through the energy transition. And of course, Canada is a great location for direct ocean capture. Ocean temperature doesn't matter as long as it's not ice. So we can operate anywhere on the coast of Canada. Next chart. So finally, is this real, or is this just somebody talking to a PowerPoint slide? So no, it's real. Our technology is already demonstrated in the top right-hand corner. That's our pilot plant. It's a 100-ton per year capacity. That's at the port of Los Angeles in California. It operates end to end and has helped us be one of the X Prize finalists. We competed in the Carbon Removal X Prize that the Musk Foundation funded. There were 1,300 competitors. We're down to the last 20. And the final winner will be revealed next April. At that location, we also do a lot of ocean health monitoring. So we have an outflow of our CO2 depleted ocean water. We confirm that it's still compatible with wastewater standards. Oxygen levels are still there, alkalinity, pH, soluble solids, all the things that marine life needs. We ensure that our outflow stays consistent with that. We actually capture our outflow, and we're growing mussels in the outflow to demonstrate that we don't impact marine life. Mussels, by the way, I didn't know this, are one of the most sensitive life forms to changes in ocean chemistry and biology. All of those results are published online. You can go to capturacorp.com if you'd like to learn more about the technology, about why we think this is very cost-effective and scalable. And also you can learn about our ocean health program. We publish the results of what we're doing. We're an open book. So that summarizes why the ocean is attractive for CDR and why there are technologies like Captura's, which we think can make a significant impact. And I'll say again, I think Canada is an excellent location for this technology. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chief. That was really interesting. I had no idea that mussels were kind of a really good sign of ocean health. Great. So with that, we're going to move on to our next panelist. We have Dr. Martin van den Berg, from the CEO and founder of Cytochrome. We also have Andrew Ray, who's the CEO of Fathom Technologies. We're first going to hear from Martin, who received his doctorate from the University of Southern California, focused on geomicrobiology, exploring bacteria-mineral interactions. He earned his master's at Queen's University on environmental geochemistry and his undergrad at the University of Victoria in geology. He has had a wide-ranging career from working as an environmental consultant, a field geologist, and in a number of startups, including his most recent venture where he founded Cytochrome. With that, I will pass it over to you, Martin.
Yeah, okay, perfect, awesome, thank you. Well, hi everyone, I'm excited to share Cytochrome and some of my experiences here. Yeah, let's get started. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm probably not breaking any news here, but I'm sure a lot of you are aware more than Canada alone needs to reduce its emissions by 40% by 2050 to meet its targets. And even it's, you know, just like Steve mentioned, I'm going to piggyback off of a bunch of what he said. Even if we're to, you know, decarbonize all industries today, there's still billions of tons of mobile emissions that need to be removed every year. So next slide, please. So basically the model that the world seems to be focusing on a lot, and by that I mean the major investments, billions of dollars worth of investments, focus around this model here, whereby there's two components to carbon capture and storage. There's the capture and then the storage part. So next slide. So the capture side of things is pretty is generally relatively mature and scalable. That these are, you know, technologies like Captura or, you know, CO2 solutions. I'm sure you've seen, you know, carbon engineering, all these sorts of solutions, either at the point source or direct air capture. These are generally scalable. But next slide. But the storage part of the problem is the real problem, because then the storage typically involves, in that model, involves capturing that CO2. That CO2 is a gas in a bottle. What do you do with it? Then the model involves shipping it on pipeline and or ship up to a well injection site where that CO2 now is pumped underground, deep underground, whether on land or here in the picture offshore, off of basically an offshore rig that turned around its operations and decided to pump stuff instead of pulling stuff out of the earth. But that model, that storage model, just doesn't really exist. At least it's invested in, but it's not showing promising results. And these are the results here from the Northern Lights in offshore Norway, the biggest project of the kind. I'm not going to get into all the details, but I highly recommend reading through these results. They're very, very interesting. But next slide. But summarizing these findings very briefly here, and they have many, again, I highly recommend going through them if you want more details. But the very, very last points that they make in there, and these are their own words. I didn't write this, right? But their very own conclusions from their attempts to pump CO2 underground offshore is that MRV, monitoring and verification, is very difficult. And they basically cannot control how the CO2 moves around underground, and they're not immune to problems with the inherent geology. And again, the last few words that are highlighted: keeping CO2 securely in the ground permanently cannot be guaranteed, simply because they just don't have a good handle on how that CO2 migrates through the geologic formations. So that's a pretty big problem. Next slide. So basically, there's not a very good permanent storage for CO2 solution, at least if you use that standard model. The subsurface CO2 injection model is risky. It's subject to CO2 leakage, groundwater contamination if that CO2 leaks, seismic activity. Also has limitations in capacity because you are limited to the regional geology, and that has inherent limitations in its scale. It's very costly because you need to purify the CO2 to a high degree of purity. You need to ship the CO2. And then you need very, very, very long term, I'm talking centennial, if not more, term monitoring, and at the regional scale, monitoring and reporting and verification. These are very energy intensive workflows. They do add up to 50% of the total cost of the entire carbon capture and storage process. So it's a very, next slide, please. This whole model is very cost ineffective. And basically the planet needs a CO2 storage solution that is low risk, secure, cost effective, and high capacity. This is where the oceans come in. Next slide, please. So a little diagram again, you know, building upon what Steve said. There's the oceans are, the world's oceans are by far the biggest reservoir of carbon in the world, more than, you know, forests and what have you, more than the atmosphere by a long shot. Now, basically what happens, like Steve said, if you put CO2 in the atmosphere, a big chunk of it will go in the oceans. The problem with that is that it does cause ocean acidification. Now, if you do have this alkalinity component to it, which basically neutralizes the carbon, then it binds the carbon, transforms it to that bicarbonate, which is basically salt, it's baking soda, and keeps it in the ocean as such. And this is a very, very uncontroversial form of permanent carbon storage. And neutralizes the acidification as well of the oceans, right? So that alkalinity component is what enables that CO2 to be both in the oceans, but to stay in the oceans and not cause acidification. So this is where the whole OAE idea comes from, right? So if we can, again, harness the power of the oceans and add enough alkalinity to draw down the CO2, there's basically no amount of CO2 that we emit that could really cause a dent in the already enormous amounts of CO2 in the oceans. That it won't change the overall ocean chemistry other than pH. But if we, again, adding that alkalinity neutralizes the pH, the acidity. So using the ocean leads to no effective capacity limitations in terms of a solution for permanent CO2 storage. And yeah, using alkalinity is a safe, very uncontroversial, very well-known and secure form of permanent CO2 storage. And it's not CO2 gas, it would be, again, CO2 as bicarbonate, which is a salt and dissolved in the oceans. Next slide, please. There are limitations of the OAE. The big ones are MRV. Again, so if you basically release a whole bunch of, typically the standard model for OAE involves releasing alkaline agents in the oceans. Doing so then now draws down the CO2 and fixes it as bicarbonate. That works well, but the oceans are big and they're complex. They have a lot of microbiology, macrobiology, the physical and chemical activity. They're very big, and making sure that whatever chemical agents, alkaline agents we put in the oceans do indeed, for sure, then down the line, draw down the CO2 in the amounts that we can be absolutely sure of, and sure enough to sell carbon credits and satisfy the world. That's difficult. That's surprisingly difficult, and the oceans are just that big and that complex. There's also a regulatory environment. There's risks with involving introducing chemical agents in the oceans, and also risks with public perception. I'm not going to get into all the details behind that. I come from an environmentalist background myself. I firmly believe this is a very safe way to do it, but the public perception, as the word says, it takes the lies will go 1,000 times around the earth before the truth comes out, right? So next slide, please. So anyways, this is how cytochrome was kind of came to be. So basically, we have our reactors. We, unlike most of OAE, actually, I have it on the next slide if you want to bring the next slide over. Thank you. So basically, we have a reactor. And our reactor, unlike most of OAE, which involves releasing chemical agents to the oceans and letting chemistry do its thing, in the oceans, we do basically the same reaction, but inside of a contained reactor onshore, on land. So this is a fully self-contained reactor whereby we take, it's very simple, and I call it the bucket. It's just a reactor, a bucket. And we take seawater, we pump seawater out of the ocean, put it in the reactor. We take ultramafic minerals. These are minerals that naturally react with CO2. And then we take CO2. Now, we can't take atmospheric CO2, but like Steve said, it's very dilute. We can now offtake people's CO2 either through flue gas exhausts or direct air capture. And we can take people's CO2, and that includes low purity CO2. We can actually take low purity CO2 quite effectively. And we mix everything up in the bucket with a magical sauce. And in that reaction, we dissolve the minerals that as the alkalinity transforms the CO2 to bicarbonate. All this within the reactor. And then once all the conditions are there and we're satisfied with them, we release the seawater out in the ocean. And because it's all self-contained, we can control everything that goes in, we can control everything that goes out, reducing any risks with any environmental risks or even public perception, anything like that. And also because we do this within a contained and engineered reactor, we can really control the thermodynamics of the reaction in a way that really, really accelerates this weathering process. And we can recover critical metals that are commonly found in these, in trace amounts, but still found, like nickel, cobalt, chromium, found in these minerals. So basically, the whole reactor enhances the weathering of that mineral, that generates the alkalinity, fixes the CO2, but that all happens within the reactor. And then there's all a single step, and then like I said, and because it's all in a single environment, we can control the MRV very, very effectively at very low cost. Okay, next slide, please. So this is it. These are our labs in our lab facilities in St. John's. And so we have reactors from as little flasks and tubes to 10-liter reactors, to 500-liter reactors, to 2,000-liter reactors on these photos. And we can test with real seawater on tap. We process 3,000 liters of seawater in a minute. So it's really, really nice scaling up and, testing facility. Next slide, please. And yeah, so our model basically involves if we are to capture CO2, we, Cytochrome, now can develop our reactors on a coastline and therefore offtake people's CO2 right at the coastline, removing the transport and storage offshore or well injection site storage places. And in that respect, we cut off costs, risks, and then store the CO2 right off the coastline in a much more safe and a cost-effective way. Next slide, please. Right, and that summarizes this. By doing that, we remove the transport and the storage components, removing a lot of the risk, a lot of the complexity, a lot of the costs, and saves up to 50% of total CO2 sequestration costs. It's very scalable. There's no amount of minerals that we are going to run out of. There's a lot of those minerals out there. We're not going to run out of CO2, unfortunately, and we're not going to run out of seawater. So it's highly scalable. Next slide, please. And yeah, last few slides, the challenges for a startup, fundraising, it's been the last couple of years have been a very, very, very difficult, challenging fundraising environment. So, between inflation, geopolitics, everything. The other thing is the world has gotten a bit too used to, Google and Netflix. This sort of effort is basically terraforming, no joke. Like we are talking about, changing a climate of an entire planet. So this is obviously extremely capital intensive, especially with scale. These are a heavy industry, basically. So things like, VC funds are not always well equipped to deal with that sort of environment. And, this is where regulatory uncertainty and financial uncertainty really can play a very big role and very big challenge in raising funds and scaling up. I can operate in the lab from any scale from this big to, again, 2,000 liters. Scaling up bigger than that becomes quite a bit more difficult. And these are some of the major challenges. Next slide, please. And lastly, it's an uneven playing field. That whole well injection thing is basically the oil and gas industry doing what they know how to do, or trying to flip around in what they're doing, basically pumping stuff in the ground instead of pumping it out. But this is an industry, a world that is getting an awful lot of help, hundreds of millions of dollars, euros, you name it, from governments for well injection projects. Again, the Northern Lights get a lot of money from EU and Norwegian governments, hundreds of millions of dollars. I don't get that much money, right? Despite the technical difficulties, the USAS 45Q, Inflation Reduction Act, all these are explicitly aimed at well injection sites and well injection carbon storage. Not ocean carbon storage. And yeah, startups and like oil and gas and these sorts of major infrastructure like that and major global companies, startups aren't very well, can't afford billion-dollar mistakes, right? So that's the other major challenge for the startup. I'll leave it at that. I'm right about time, so I'll be happy to take questions or discuss this later. But yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Martin. I thought that was really interesting, how you compared what the work you're doing and kind of traditional, in quotes, CCUS. It's still pretty novel of a process, so it's funny to say traditional, but that was a really interesting comparison. So we're gonna pass it over now to Andrew Ray from Fathom Technologies. He has an educational background in astrophysics, space studies, and an MBA from Brigham Young University focused on entrepreneurship. He has held many roles throughout his career, including working as a spacecraft systems engineer, founding a number of startups, sitting on the board of directors for 9 different organizations in Halifax, and most recently as the managing director of Nova Scotia First Fund, developing the thesis and strategy for investment. Andrew is the CEO of Fathom Technologies, and he is here today to talk about the amazing work that they are doing.
Thanks, Shannon. I have no slides. When they shared the slides, I saw Martin's slides, and I'm like, this is great. I don't have to do any slides of my own. Martin's company and my company went through the Carbon Next Accelerator together. And so I got to know one of his colleagues fairly well. And we have a similar technology with a similar value proposition where we're using essentially limestone instead of ultramafic rocks to do something similar. What is probably different, and I thought seeing his slides, I don't need to go through all the technical details of how we're doing it, but essentially it's the same premise, but with a different source of alkalinity. And so I thought what would be more useful rather than rehashing all that is sort of walking through the story, because I've approached the company building and the entrepreneurship side from a different perspective. And it sort of starts with my background in venture capital. I spent about 10 years doing venture capital. We've invested in climate tech companies. Those companies have done quite well. One of those companies we invested in 5 years ago. It's called Planetary Technologies. They do ocean alkalinity enhancement. And they directly put things like magnesium hydroxide in the ocean, which raises the alkalinity, which then shifts the equilibrium and pulls CO2 or converts CO2 from CO2 into bicarbonate. So this is sort of that underlying technology. But what's interesting about sort of my journey is, first off, my company, we are just founded this year. So we're a new company that hasn't originally developed our own technology. But given my time in the space, when I was talking with Mike Kellen, the CEO of Planetary Technologies, when we were looking at that, our thesis around that company was, even if they don't do capture, just doing ocean storage is a huge opportunity. As both Steve and Martin have mentioned, the ocean is a massive carbon sink. And if you can leverage that, it gets really interesting because it's the biggest sink we have. And that was fundamentally the basis of our investment in Planetary. Is 5 years ago, we were looking at this and we're like, the ocean is the place this should go. This is a natural solution to where does carbon go today when we capture it. And so that's how we ended up investing in them. But a few years ago, or a year and a half or so ago, we had introduced that company to an investor in this who was interested in investing in the company. So this was a CEO of an energy company, and I knew that they had developed this technology that was, let's say, similar to what Martin has developed, and they had this technology inside, but they weren't even actually pursuing that technology because they were doing this not for power plants, but in the ocean. So I had pitched to the CEO of, here's a technology that can capture the CO2 from your power plants and then store that in the ocean as bicarbonate. This energy company CEO was super interested. He wanted to invest in the company. He says, I want to give you money, but you need to focus on this solution for us, not the broader, how do we pull CO2 out of the air solution. And the company's like, that's not our mission. That's not what we're doing. And we have money to go do it this way. And so they continued down that path. At the time, I looked at my partner at the venture fund and I'm like, we need to stand up this company because somebody needs to do this. Because if you look at the energy world today, as the world electrifies, we're going to basically double the amount of electricity that we need in the world between now and 2050. And to get there, we're not, unfortunately, likely to turn off those power plants that are already running. Wind and solar are great, but they can't fully replace firm baseload power. And so our premise was somebody needs to go out there and capture this CO2. And so somehow, as let's say climate tech entrepreneurs, we got into this idea that we need to solve coal. Coal isn't going away. It's a dirty space, and probably nobody on the line here wants to touch coal because it's not ideologically the right answer. But for half of the world, it's going to happen. To give some coal numbers, just coastal coal plants in Asia will emit about 80 billion tons of CO2 over the remaining useful lifetime. So don't build any new coal plants, just keep the existing ones running, 80 billion tons of CO2. And so we're like, somebody has to do something for that because those coal plants aren't just going to shut down by themselves. They're not going to be replaced by wind and solar. And so we saw this as a basically low-hanging fruit of, yes, we need to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, but we also need to stop those 80 billion tons from getting into the air. Those 80 billion tons alone will result in a 0.5 degree of global warming just from those existing coal plants. So we're like, we need to go do something in this space. And it's a dirty part of climate change, but let's go see if we can make something happen. So this energy company CEO, he was like, I want this technology to clean up my fossil fuel plants. The government is basically forcing me to shut down these plants, and I've got billions of dollars tied up in these assets, and I don't want to shut them down. I'm going to push back, but if I could clean them up cost effectively, that's what I want to do. So a couple of meetings later, we're like, we should spin this technology out of this company, set up a company to go basically do this. And he offered us money as an investor and support and sort of resources going into a customer. I think that's one of the things that sort of makes us different from other companies in this space is like, this is the classic startup game. Start with the customer, go for that market pull. If somebody says, I'll give you lots of money to go do this for me as a customer, that's where there's an opportunity. And so we have this idea inside our company of the burning platform. We want customers who are desperate for this solution. It's not a, here's what you need to do world. Here's a technology to solve your problems. Now pay me for it. Find a customer who says, I want to pay you to solve my problem and I'm desperate for a solution. And then going down that route, now you get customers who will help you get there. So let's say with a similar technology to what Martin sort of described, we had a very warm introduction into an engineer whose coal plant is going to be shutting down in 2030 if they don't do anything. That coal plant would run until 2040 if there was no regulation by the Canadian government forcing them to change. Like they wouldn't do anything if they weren't forced to. But now we go into our first meeting with this power company. It's like, here's what we're proposing. And as Stephen mentioned before, he's like, this was just a PowerPoint. Like I'm literally in this meeting, I've got nothing in terms of technology. And I'm like, here's what this technology can do for you. And they're like, we would like to try that out. We'd like to pilot with you. I'm like, oh, this is great. Now I've got to go figure out how to actually build this thing and bring this technology to market. So that's sort of where it started. And then the next stage was the reason this utility company was recommended to us and introduced to us was in the coal space, they capture today sulfur dioxide and they use limestone scrubbers, which was exactly this technology that we're proposing to use to capture CO2. So it became incredibly interesting about this opportunity for us and was what was recognized by this energy company CEO is we can go in and leverage their $300 million piece of equipment to start capturing CO2 at scale without having to first spend $300 million to do it. And so we turn this sort of into a pilot where we're not doing it at full scale. The existing equipment they have, it's a 7-story tall, 50-foot in diameter reactor. We've piloted this size, and now we've got this energy company saying, go from this size to 7 stories tall. And that thing will do 200,000 tons a year. And we can do, basically, we reimagined our process to fit within the existing equipment that they had. And so now we've got a path to do very large scale pilot tests. I mean, we've also got our scale up models going on in parallel so that when we get to that 7-story tall unit, we're ready, but we're starting with this unit in mind and building up to that instead of building without an idea necessarily where we're going. So now we've got this very large scale pilot. And what's really great is it uses existing equipment. So on our end, it's not CapEx heavy, at least until we deploy at scale. So we can prove this thing out at scale for essentially none of our own hardware costs. And our pilot tests that we're using, we're leveraging other people's equipment because this is equipment that's common to the industry. The other thing that's nice about this solution is when we were talking to investors about funding this, they're interested, but they're like, if this scales, if you're going to remove the 500 million tons that we were proposing, they're like, where are you going to get the billion tons of limestone from? And so limestone is ubiquitous, much like olivine is ubiquitous. But what's nice about limestone is there's an existing infrastructure for pulling limestone out of the ground because it's used as cement and in the aggregate industry. So today they're producing 6 billion tons of limestone. And when I went to my US investors and said, where are you going to get 1 billion tons of limestone? I Googled billion tons of limestone in Nova Scotia, and there's a limestone deposit sitting right on the ocean with deep sea access that the government is looking to develop, and it's 1 billion tons of limestone. And so you pull these things together, and what becomes unique about this opportunity is not so much the technology development, but this idea of starting with a customer who can move things and who's desperate. Now you've got a solution targeted on this specific company that could then scale thereafter. And so now we don't have all of these overhead costs of large amounts of equipment, like hundreds of millions of dollars of equipment. We don't have to go build new basically supply chains to get it there. And now all of a sudden, our company looks like a traditional startup company, where over the next 6 or 7 years, our development costs are mostly people instead of hardware development. And our supply chains are baked in, so we don't have to figure out how we're going to do this at scale. Some other nice things about the power plant, as Steve mentioned earlier, is they're already pumping massive amounts of water through these plants. So we're going to leverage that water that's going through the plant, and they've got these massive limestone scrubbers, and basically we're just going to repurpose them to do CO2 capture instead of sulfur dioxide capture. I guess the caveat to that is we needed them to switch from coal to something else that didn't have sulfur in it as a fuel. But because they're being forced off of coal, they've been doing some pilot tests burning wood. And so we're going to actually they're burning wood in that plant now, and that gives us access to the scrubber. And then it also gives us access to selling carbon credits that are similar to direct air capture through bioenergy, carbon capture, and then ocean storage play. So you get access to these higher value credits, existing equipment, and then ocean storage. Their alternative was actually to capture the CO2 using a traditional approach and then pump it basically via pipeline to off the coast of Nova Scotia to Sable Island in an oil and gas well. So if this technology works, it saves them a huge amount on storage, it's cheaper on capture, and it can leverage a whole bunch of their existing equipment. And so that's just that approach of how do we move faster? Because this is a problem that needs to be solved now, not in 10 or 20 years' time. And how do we sort of take that entrepreneurial mindset, that startup mindset, and apply it to the climate challenge of we need to do something that customers will pay us to do and leverage that to get us to market quicker. So that's a bit of my story. It was less presentation-y and more just talking about where we got, but also interested for the rest of the conversation with you all.
Thanks so much, Andrew. Yeah, I think your model is very interesting because you had a industry coming saying, I have a big problem, I need you to solve it, which is the way that most startups should be founded, to find those gaps and find those needs. But it's not always the way that they're started. So I just thought your story is very interesting. And with that, we're going to move over to our Q&A. So first question is for Steve. As a previous entrepreneur working on direct air capture, DAC, what interested you in pivoting to work on direct ocean capture, DOC?
Yeah, I mean, Carbon Engineering, my previous company's been a really successful DAC company, and a good news story across the board, I think. For me, part of this is the technology, but also part of it is just what I like to do. I kind of like to be at the start of companies. Carbon Engineering is now very closely partnered, was acquired by Occidental. Occidental knows how to do things really big. They're building by far the largest carbon capture plant in the world in Texas. So that's great. I think Carbon Engineering and DAC will be very successful. But I like the early stage stuff. And for me, the solution that Captura brings, this ability to utilize the ocean, it's really compelling. So even down to the name, we chose the name DOC because it's a lot like DAC. DAC has got a lot of momentum, especially in the United States. And what we're seeking to do is demonstrate that you can use the ocean as the medium to do direct air capture just as effectively. So yeah, a kind of a mix of personal stuff and also just liking the technology space.
Great, thank you. I also know you have to leave a couple of minutes early, so I just want to front load your questions.
Okay.
We do have an audience question about what do you do with the CO2 from your system, the output CO2?
Yeah, exactly the same as direct air capture. We produce a stream of CO2 that can be measured, it can be utilized. The use of CO2 combined with production of hydrogen to make hydrocarbons, synthetic fuels, is a really, I think, interesting market opportunity. People may have heard of synthetic fuels made out of used cooking oil, city trash. Those are all fine solutions, but you're limited by feedstock. Producing a fuel from a combination of hydrogen and CO2 taken out of the ocean means you're literally making fuel out of water, which is interesting for applications like aviation, which really struggle with electrification. Or you can sequester. We can sequester using the same types of processes that Martin and Andrew have described, or we can do geological sequestration, saline aquifers. There is a lot of capacity for sequestration around the world, and there's lots of people working on it. So we focus on our little piece of the jigsaw, which is how can we remove CO2 and produce a stream from the ocean?
Great, thank you. I'm going to pass it over to Andrew and Martin, and Steve, you're welcome to join in on this question as well. But what are the major challenges to ocean carbon technology development?
I'm happy to start on that. So for us, I mean, just when we looked at this problem, the number one challenge or the number one risk we see to our business is, can we safely store this in the ocean? And can we get permitting? Can we get the community buy-in? And for us, we're convinced on the science side that this is actually beneficial and that we can help buffer some of the acidity in the ocean. But there are concerns of, in theory, this all works, but how do we prove to ourselves and the world that when we put this carbon in the ocean, it will stay in there for tens or hundreds of thousands of years? And so that's our primary focus. That's the number one thing we're hitting on is, when we put it in there, will it stay in there? And can we get the public license and the regulatory licenses to basically do this? Will the public support what we're doing? Doesn't matter if it's good or bad. If the public doesn't like it, it's not going to happen. And so those are the things that we're focused on first, is building that community support for what we're doing, leveraging sort of the fisherman community in Atlantic Canada, frankly, where lobster are being hurt by the acidic waters. Like DFO has done some research where lobsters growing up in acidic waters have like almost no claws and softer shells. And by 2050, those lobster are going away if we don't do something. And putting in alkalinity or carbonates or bicarbonate in those waters around them. There's some who've said, we want you to put this in right where we're fishing lobsters so that it will help grow them. But that's the biggest risk, is getting community support for it, I think.
Yeah, I'll second that. I think MRV from the traditional OAEs, which aren't represented here today, but which include Vesta Plantaris as such, where involve releasing a lot of alkaline materials directly in the ocean and let the reaction happen there. I think MRV is overwhelmingly the biggest problem. Now that's a big part of why we chose to go reactor based, and I guess Andrew as well to a degree. Yep. And within a reactor, your signal to noise ratio is so much higher in your favor, and you know exactly what's going on. So it makes it a heck of a lot easier. Now, using silicate as the alkalinity makes it easier still, because it's much more stable than, say, just carbon, which can fluctuate as one species of CO2 to bicarbonate a bit easier on its own. But yeah, I think MRV is the biggest issue. Which again, so much easier to do within a reactor system. And if anything, also between financing to scale up, again, for capital intensive stuff, and maybe Andrew, you get lucky there with one site, but if you want to scale up to many gigaton level, it's always the same thing, right? But scale up, and then yeah, the regulatory environment, both for emissions, like water released back in the environment, but also for the carbon credit market. That's still something that it's a global problem. It should be a global market, but every country has its own, and there's some baggage with the whole forestation, afforestation, reforestation. It gets murky, and investors don't like that. So that's one of the biggest issues in my mind.
Just a quick comment from me. I do have to leap off, I'm afraid. People can follow up with capture on our website. But I do want to make just a comment on this. There's some really interesting growing momentum. If you follow Henry's law, it doesn't matter whether you take CO2 out of the ocean or the atmosphere. The effect is ultimately the same on the biosphere. And that's what we're seeking to achieve. So the United States government became the first government to buy carbon credits. And they put out an RFP, a request for proposals, that addresses either removal from the atmosphere or the shallow ocean. because Henry's law says ultimately you achieve the same effect. The X prize for carbon removal is the same. You can take out of the atmosphere or out of the ocean. So we see growing momentum in this. And of course, we are very strongly in favor of that because Henry's law is very well understood. So that makes MRV easier, especially in our case. We produce a stream of measurable CO2. You know exactly how much CO2 you took out of the ocean. And with that, I have to jump off. My apologies.
Thank you so much, Steve, for your time.
Thanks.
I'll do one more question for Andrew and Martin before we finish out here. What keeps you motivated to continue persevering through the tech development journey? We all know this is not the easiest road and path that you can travel. So what keeps you motivated as you're working through this?
I'll let Martin start on this one, but I've got some good thoughts too.
I was hoping you would start, honestly.
I'm happy to start on it. For
I don't have one that I could say in one sentence. So
let me just start by saying, being an entrepreneur again, this feels so much more risky and stressful than being an investor. An investor, rationally, I can look at this and say, somebody needs to do this. Here are the odds of success. I know what my odds are for success, and they're low. This is why, like, we need me doing this. We need Martin doing this. We need Steve doing this, because one of us needs to be successful. And so we as a whole, we all need to be in this together, and we all need to be doing it together because somebody needs to be successful. As an entrepreneur, that is way, like, as an individual company, it's like, this is so much more stressful than if I've got 20 companies trying to push forward for the same thing. And for me, it's about that community of, like, we need to do this for each other. Even if this doesn't work, if this doesn't go away, I'll be fine. I'll be able to figure out what I'm doing later. But if this doesn't work, and this was this was those 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 20 that was really going to remove billions of tons, somebody needs to be doing this. And I looked at a career in venture capital and could have stayed there and been comfortable for a while, but it was like, I feel like I need to be doing something because we need as many people doing this as we can. So we need me trying this out. Even though me and Martin have similar solutions, they're different enough that maybe this one works, maybe Martin's works, and we just need one of them to work. And I can do this one. I've got an opportunity right in front of me that I just have to, I can't, if I don't do it, who will do this? And if this was the answer, yeah, just sort of coasting and having a sort of a comfortable life might not be that comfortable. And we have hurricanes year after year after year here in Halifax.
Yeah, summed up really nicely, actually. Same, a lot of my thoughts sound like that as well. Is we sort of, the history of how Cytochrome came to be is a bit less top down and it's more bottoms up, but although it is a windy road, but we already had a lot of traction to begin with. But it's not like we have the one person being like, okay, I need this at my site, and that's it. We had a bit, bigger vision than that. But I think a big part of it is, yeah, ultimately what led to this is, spending some time in this space, getting to see who are the actors, what's being done, how are things being done, and having the science background myself behind it. You look at some things and it just, there's a scratch my head a little bit, being like, a lot of resources are being put into things that we don't know if they're going to work. And again, maybe they will work, maybe they won't. But like Steve said, the actual scale of the problem is so much bigger than any of this. So ultimately, even if every single solution works, it's still not enough. I think a big part of me is, and that's on the assumption that all solutions do work. And I have some serious questions about a lot of, strategies. I do think the oceans inevitably are overwhelmingly the odds-on favorite solution for storage. And that is, we can capture CO2 fairly easily. We don't know how to store it. And it just boggles the mind that, we're still in 2024 stuck at, like, even figuring out what the basic strategy is. And that's the thing. I look around and I can't help but feel like, well, who's going to do this if not, me? Or I don't want to sound like I have a messianic complex or anything, but, this needs to be done. And if I don't do it, I know, well, now, Andrew does it, but it's, if both Andrew and I are successful, it's still not enough. So this needs to happen. So yeah, that's kind of the where my mind's to.
Yeah, definitely. This is a very interesting space when you work in climate, and it kind of becomes most of your life, I find. Just kind of working on the peripherals of it. So thank you both so much. We could chat for probably half an hour more. I have a bunch of audience questions, so I might pass those along to the panelists and we can include those in the follow-up email. But thank you all for coming today. I just have my last slide here. We're very excited for the talk we had today, and thank you so much to our panelists. CarbonNext is powered by PrairieScan, Scotiabank, and our partner organization, Carbon Management Canada. And we really thank you for attending today.